Hello everyone and welcome back to Extra Inch Education. Today we will talk about VBA coding for Excel. At this video you will be learning a lot about Excel Visual Basic for Applications, which is what VBA stands for. This video will take you from the beginner level to intermediate level, and will include a lot of useful stuff. If you aware or not aware about macros, this video will suit you. So, don't go away. Grape your cup of tea and sit back and enjoy the new learning. This video will be followed by other new videos for the intermediate and experienced levels. With this video we will discuss the VBA language, and we will record some macros using VBA terminology. And we will learn how to create new buttons and add them in the ribbon or in the interface of Excel. Now let's start learning. So, what is VBA? VBA stands for Visual Basic for Applications. VBA is a tool for programming, editing, and running application code. VBA is not a standalone program. It will not run code within a host application, which in our case is Excel. So, running VBA tool in Excel will allow us do things which we are not able to do at Excel without VBA. It will allow us custom design our own functions in Excel. As an example, it is common to convert numbers into percentage using %style button here. This function has already been programmed by Excel. But what if I need to be able to do something for which there isn't already a function in Excel? Like calculating shapes area. At this case, we will need to make our own functions which I can't do directly in Excel, but I can do it with VBA. Moving to VBA interface. At the right-hand side of my screen, you will see the VBA window. The window contains this ribbon here like the one we used to have at Excel. And then up here, we do have these drop-down menus. At the left-hand side we will see Project Panel, and under here's the Properties panel. And then on the right-hand side, we will see a coding window over here. Don't panic now, things will be clear soon, and we'll talk later about what each one of these does. Now let's move on. One of the most important things to notice in all Microsoft applications is that we always have to select the elements first before we can do changes or add effects to any it. The reason is that the beginning of every programming statement must start by defining the object I want to apply changes to. As an example, if I want to change the color of cell A1 to green color, then I have to select that cell and change it from the ribbon here. There will be no way to make that kind of change without selecting that cell. And if I want to convert this into code, you should see the beginning of the statement say cell A1, then followed by the changes you want to apply. And that's what object-oriented programming means to us. So, object-oriented programming is an excellent description for the coding language that we are going to use as we get to know VBA. This programming language will always have to define an object at the beginning of each statement that happens. We will be talking about this language in detail at a later stage, but it's important to understand the basics of object-oriented programming languages at this stage. Now as the concept is clear, let's open up our Excel and start making our basic modifications to Excel by doing some macros. Here I am in Excel 2016. However, if you are using an earlier version of the program like Excel 2010 or earlier, no worries, you will still be able to do the same things we will do at this video. First, open a full blank workbook sheet. So, the tab we need in order to be able to play with all of the macro stuff is called the Developer tab. Since we cannot see it at the ribbon, we need to turn it on. So the only thing we need to do is to click the mouse right button at the ribbon area here. That will open our Excel options window. From the option Customize the ribbon, you will see a list of the tabs of the ribbon that are enabled currently. And if you have any tabs of the ribbon that are disabled, the boxes next to them will be unchecked. In our case, we do have a tab of the ribbon called Developer. However, the box is unchecked. And that's the tab I want. So, I'm going to click on the box and click and press OK. And that's going to enable the tab of the ribbon for me. I can click on it and take a look on it. And that is where we're going to get started here. So now we will be able to start recording some macros. Now, what is macros recording? Lucky for us these days that we don't actually have to write any coding manually to create our very own macro. Because we have this amazing tool called the macro recorder. So, once we click on Record Macro, VBA will watch everything that we do in Excel, and then it converts it into codes. And once we have that code stored in VBA, we can choose to re-execute that whenever we want. As an example, if you want to automate tasks, like copying, pasting data or change formats for a report you receive on a weekly basis, Excel macros will help you avoid repeating all the steps during that process just by one click. Excel macro will record your report modification steps instead of remembering and applying the same steps again and again. Now let me show you how with these simple examples. Let's say for instance, a couple of times a day, I'm getting these reports from my department and it's my job to put on a report title. And then I also have to format that report title. Maybe I have to turn it bold and change my font type and underline, and I have to put an outline on it, and I have to turn it blue. And I have to make it bigger. So, doing those steps every time will be a repeating process, and we might forget one of it, and it will consume our time. So, if I could save the process of going through this, as a macro, and then have VBA redo all these steps for me, whenever I would like, will make our life easier. So let's do our first macro together after delete this. Now there are different ways you can start recording a macro. One way is to click on this record button down here. In case you don't see it, just right mouse clicks and place a check mark beside macro recording. Another way you can record macros is from Developer tab at your ribbon. Now, by pressing Record Macro, I'm going to ask VBA to watch everything that I do and store it as a macro. This will open up a little wizard here that I can use to create this macro. The first thing you have to do before start is to think about the steps that you want to do, because every click that you make, every change you make to a cell will be recorded. So, I'm going to rename that, and I'll call Report Head with no space. Next I have to establish a shortcut key for this macro, or a keyboard shortcut. Now if you think about this, you know you have to be careful here. Because there already are keyboard shortcuts we have, like Ctrl+X, Ctrl+Z and Ctrl+C. Those are all already keyboard shortcuts, and so I don't want to put Ctrl+C here, would be a mistake, because Ctrl+C already does copy. So, it's a good idea to put two keys in this box, so I'm going to hold Shift and tap A. So Ctrl-Shift and now is the keyboard shortcut that I'm reserving for this macro that I'm about to create. Now, there are a couple of different places where you can store your macro. You can store it in this workbook. Or you can store it in your personal macro workbook. The differences are, if you store it in this workbook, it will be able to travel with this document. So, you can send it off to a coworker. They will also be able to use this macro. So that's kind of nice. However, it does mean that you can't really use it in any of your other Excel documents, unless you also have this one open. Now, for our purposes, I'm going to have us store it in this workbook. That's going to make it easier for us. And click OK. Now, the very first thing that I want to do is tell VBA that I always need to put my report title in cell A1. So the way that I'm going to do that, even though I already have it selected, I'm actually going to take my mouse and click on it again. So, I'm sure that my report title is always going to be in A1, and now I'm going to type in the name of my title. Very important thing to notice here is that when I'm executing that I will use Ctrl+Enter, because it doesn't actually navigate me away. So, if I used Enter, it would execute, but it would navigate me downward one cell. And I will have to re-click on cell A1 again. So, I'm going to be using Ctrl+Enter for now. Go into the Home tab, and I'm going to make all these formatting changes that I would like to make. And now after finishing all formatting, I am going to make sure to go back to the Developer tab and click on Stop Recording. And I will have my Record Macro button back. And now I have that macro, so that macro is saved. So, let's say I need to be able to rerun this in another place. I'm going to go down and click on this plus button. And create a brand new sheet here. And then I'm going to try and run my macro here. So, I'm going to my macros button. I'm going to find that macro that I just created. Again, that macros button in the ribbon, that's where I'm going to find the list of all the macros that I have. Click on it and click on Run. And that's going to run that macro right there, all steps at once. And that's the whole point of the macro recorder. Now, when we just ran this macro that we just created, the reason why it looked so nice and perfect is because it was set up so that it specifically recorded and then ran this macro in cell A1. And the reason is that by default, All these macros are going to be recording location referencing. Now, let's say I want to be able to run this macro in a different location. Maybe I want to be able to run it in cell B2. The problem is that the macro as I've recorded it doesn't run anywhere else except for A1. And if I click on macro and again, you will get your results on cell A1 only. And it can't run anywhere else. So if I want to be able to have this macro run in all these different spots, then I'm going to need to turn on use relative references. So in order for us to create a macro that actually does in different spots, we will need to use relative references. Let's go ahead and repeat the same example at another cell. Whichever cell we want to eventually start in before we click on use relative reference. I've selected on cell C3. I'm turning on my use relative reference button and I'm going to click on record macro. And we're just going to repeat the same example here. We're going to say these are title head 2. I'm going to skip the shortcut key. I'm going to store it in the workbook and I'm going to click OK. Now repeat the same formats we want for the title, and when you're done, of course, make sure to execute using Ctrl plus Enter. And then of course at the end, click on Stop Recording. And now I want to be able to execute the title page under here. I can click on my macros button, find my titles head 2 and click on Run, and it's going to run it over here. And then I could also do the same thing over here. So in this circumstance, I have created a macro that can run in many different locations. Now you might be asking yourself at this point, why wouldn't I always turn on relative references? The answer for that is that sometimes we have the need to record our macro and run it in the same spot, depending on the kind of thing that we're recording. As an example, if you're going to create a macro that's supposed to sort stuff in that same column, I'm going to use the sort using the absolute references, which means I'm going to want to turn off relative references before I record that macro.so filtering macros are going to work the same way. Now let's move on and start creating some useful steps for using the macro recorder. At this sheet I have this information related to my company staff number, first names, family names, joining dates and contact numbers. Now, let's say I have a regular exercise of formatting certain values. And I have a few challenges here. I do need these phone numbers to show like American phone number formats as the one at this image here. So, I want to convert this into creating my own custom number formatting, and I'm not going to do it out here like normal, because if I did it out here, I would have to do it over and repeatedly, every time I wanted to do this. So, I'm going to turn it into a macro. That way I can use it over and over and over again, whenever I would like to. I'm going to start by going to the Developer tab, and I'm going to record my macro, but before I do so I'm going to ask myself two things. First of all, do I need to be using relative references or absolute references? And the answer yes. I want to be able to use this macro at many spots, here or here. Therefore, I want to be able to use relative references, so I have the flexibility to use this macro wherever I would like. The second questions I am going to ask myself is, do I have already selected on the cell that I want to format before I click the record macro button? So, I'm selecting the cell before I start. And then I'll click on record macro. And I'm going to name this one numbers formatting. And I'll assign a shortcut key for this one. And maybe the key is Shift and N. So, I'll use Control and Shift and N for number, and click OK. And here I go. I'm going to click the mouse right click and choose Format Cells. In my Format Cells dialog box. And I'm going to go down to my custom number formats. I'm going to change the formatting of this particular cell. And here's where we want it to show up. I always want the US area code to show up at the beginning. So, the country code for the US is +1. So that's what I want first. Then I'm going to tell Excel to start displaying my numbers here, and it should be like this, number, dash, and then the rest of the numbers. And I'll go ahead and click on OK. And then that number is formatted just like that. OK. So, I'm going to go to my Developer tab and stop recording. And now I should be able to select all the cells in this column and format them just like that. So, I'm selecting all the cells in this column using Control and Shift and down to select everything in this column. And there we go. All my numbers are formatted like that. Again, go to my list on the right hand side to practice it. Here we go, selecting on the top phone number cell. And I'm using Control and Shift and down. And then using Control and Shift and N to change to that formatting. And it's just as easy as that. Another quick example is that, if I want to change the joining dates formatting here to show the day instead of month and year only. Now I'm going to do this again as a macro, so that I can do it whenever I want with the keyboard shortcut. At this example we need to use relative references as well. So we will be able to do this in a bunch of different places. Next, make sure you have clicked on a cell that has the values in it that I want to format before you click on Record Macro. And now click on Record Macro. Now I'm going to name it as Joining Date. And my shortcut key for this one is going to be Shift and N. I'll click OK. Use the mouse right-click and choose Format Cells, which brings me into the Format Cells dialog box. And I'm going to choose Date. From the list there I will change the format to this one. That's going to show up the day of joining, as you can see its sample area here. And I'll click OK. And that's it. I'm all done. Go into the Developer tab, stop recording. And I can grab all the cells in this column and use Ctrl and Shift and N, and there it is converted. Do that on the right-hand side table as well. Ctrl and Shift and down. And Ctrl and Shift and N for my macro. Now let's make it a little bit more interesting. Here, I have a bunch of people's names. Now I want to convert the first letter of each name into capital letter, and I want to have the first name and family name at the same column. Now, there are a couple of functions we will use here in order to accomplish the requirements. We do have the proper function. This function will change the first letter at any text into capital letter. So, I'm going to click on Record Macro here and start my function process. We're going to call this the names, and I'll use Ctrl and Shift and F for that shortcut. And here we go. Now this is going to require a few steps. We will need to put a function and some formula in there. And then we're going to need to copy stuff and paste it as values. That's going to be a little bit of a process. At this point in my macro recording career is started to write down all the steps that are required by my macro. So, it's better to break the steps down on a piece of paper to ensure not to make any mistakes. Because obviously any mistakes that we made while recording will be recorded. And now let's go ahead and do this. Now I will start typing my proper function, and then choose the column that you want to edit the text from. And then close my parentheses. Next, I want to add a space between the first name and family name. To do that I will combine that with the value returned by the proper function. So, I will open a new parenthesis and add 2 ampersands with space, and then again close my parentheses. Now I will combine all of this with the value returned by the proper function for the family name. Now, I'm going to go ahead and execute that. And then I'm going to ask this function to please populate this for the rest of the column. Now, I need to copy and paste this over here and replace the values. But we should notice that these cells are requiring information from these cells, so if I did paste it now, this would give me a reference warning. So, instead I'm going to copy it. And then paste the values that are returned by the function. Now, I'm going to go over here and delete all this stuff over here and delete the family names over here. And finally, I'm done. I'm just going to select the cell that I started on here. And I'm done recording that macro. So, go to Developer tab, I'm going to stop recording. And I can test it out on the table on the right-hand side. And I'm going to use Ctrl plus Shift plus F, which is my shortcut key. And just like that, I get all these converted that quickly. Now let's move to even more interesting and useful macros. Now let's move from our previous actions of formatting options. And this time, we're going to use some other tools in Excel in creating a few sort macros and a few filter macros. At this sheet we have some information about some sales orders. Like order ID, date, sales information locations, and some payments details. Now we will record some macros here. And when we're recording this on the Developer tab, we are going to leave this Use Relative Reference button unchosen. And the reason is that our sort and filter macros are going to work best using absolute references. And let's click on Record Macro, and our recording started. I'm going to make my first sort macro. This is going to sort by date and then by country. Now let's go to the Data tab where I find my sort tool, and I'm going to add my 2 levels. The first one is by date and the second one is by country, and I'll click OK. And we're done. Now go to my Developer tab and stop recording. Let's make one more. Go to the Developer tab, click Start Recording Macro. And this time I am going to make a sort macro that has to do with sorting by the shipment date and then the revenue. Go into my Data tab, choosing my Sort button. This time, I'm going to sort by shipment date first and then by revenue, and I'll click OK. Now I'm done. Go to the Developer tab, click Stop Recording. Now the real important part. Now instead of running my macros each time, I can turn into a button on the interface, and I can click on that button, and it will do what they want to do directly. So, if I go to the Insert tab, so on the Developer tab of the ribbon, and I'm going to the Insert button, and in the Insert menu, you'll see a bunch of controls form here, which we will go over a few more of these later. From those I will choose the button macro, it's on the top left. And when I bring my cursor back into the interface, I must click and drag to draw that shape, and this is going to be the sort by date and country. And then last, and I'll click OK. And I can right-click on this to edit the text. Now our second source is the sort by shipment date and revenue, and I'll click OK again. Editing my text here. Let's see how this works. Wonderful. For the second part we will use filtering and record a couple of filtering macros. Now I'm going to click on Record macro, and this one is going to be a filter for my customer's name and sales representative. Now I need to see the orders done by sales representative Oliver Williams to my customer company 4. And now I will stop my recording. Next, let's clear our filters. Again, let's say I want to filter my product A, and I would like to filter the achieved revenue above $20,000 by filtering those figures here. Now stop recording. So that's one. Let's say I want to filter the revenues between $15,000 and $20,000. From Filter I will choose Number Filters, and I will click on Between, and I will choose my numbers here. So, I'm done and I'm going to stop recording. Now the last one will be Clear the Filter. So, I will start recording. And from Data, I will choose to clear my filter, and I'll click OK. And now I'm going back to the Developer, stop recording. And now of course, just like before, I can create these nice looking buttons here, and this one is going to filter for customer's name and sales representative, and I'll click OK. Next, I'll put another button here. That's to filter product A and revenue above $20,000, and I'll click OK. The next button will be to filter the revenues between $15,000 and $20,000. And finally, going to put the last one here, which clear everything. And there I'm done. Now, we can filter all these requirements by just one click, and we can even see them both at the same time. If they filter one of them, and then filter the next one as well. Now don't go away, we still have some even more interesting macros that we can record. Now let's start working on new tools work well with the macro recorder. Here we will use cell and sheet protection. As an example, let's say I want to protect the content of this sheet and unlock the part where my colleague can modify. Normally you could click on any cell that we want our users to be able to modify after protected your sheet. And we go to the Format tab and say, I want to unlock those. And that's how we would create cells that an end user could modify. However, I'm not actually going to select these cells. Because once I select these cells, that will be recorded. And I can't use this on any differently built spreadsheets. So, what to do? Instead, choosing the cells, we are going to use the Find and Select tool in Excel. That's on the Home tab. First step, go into the Developer tab, clicking on Record Macro. And I'm going to call it Unlock Cells. Then I'll click OK. And now I'm going to go to the Home tab of the ribbon. I'm going to find the option that says Find and Select. I'm going to choose Go to Special. And in here I'm going to choose Constants, and I will uncheck the boxes except for numerical values. This tool will ignore text, logical and errors and just select the numbers of values that are constant, and I'm going to click OK. These tend to be input values, which tend to be the kind of thing that my end user can modify. So, I'm going to go ahead and unlock these, going to my Format tab. I'm going to unlock these numbers. I'm also going to change the colors so it will be easy to know. And then I'm going to set up my sheet with the protection. That's going to protect every other cell in the worksheet by clicking on Protect Sheet. And I'm just going to click OK. And I'm done. Go into the Developer tab and stop recording. And now if we want to test this and see if it works, we can go to a completely different looking sheet here. And it should still work here. So, I'll go to my Macros button up here. I'll find my macro, which called Unlocked Cells. And I'll click on Run. And here we go. It's worked perfectly. I should be able to click on any one of these cells. And not be able to enter any information. So there I go, clicking, and indeed I do get that error message, but I should be able to go up to the highlighted cells and change it to other value. And I was able to do that. It did modify all of the formulas in my spreadsheet. And now let's move to even more complicated macros. Now let's move to more serious step and start writing some VBA scripting. Now from Develop tab we can click on Visual Basic, and once we click it this VBA interface will appear on the right hand side of the screen. At the side we do have what's referred to as the Project Explorer over here. And we do also have the Properties window that I can see over here as well. Now the area over here is where we will have some codes. However, that's not present. I don't have any code in here. Because I don't have any macros in here. Normally, if I had some macros in here, you would see a folder that said Modules. And that folder called Modules would contain all the different macros that I have for this file. So, in order to get a module in here, I'm going to go to the Insert drop-down menu in the toolbar. I'm going to choose Module. And that inserts this module for me. It also inserts a Modules folder. And I instantly have Module 1. And I could go ahead and type in whatever code I want to. There are a couple other features that I do want you to be able to see before we move on and start doing some scripting. I want you to be able to see the immediate window, which I can display from the View drop-down menu. And from there we are going to choose my immediate window. And immediately the window will appear in this area, at the bottom of the screen. This immediate window is amazing. It allows us to be able to run little bits of code and also ask questions of our workbook. So, let's say for instance, I want to ask a question like, how many worksheets do I have in my workbook? If I'm going to ask a question, I'm always going to start with my question mark, and then I can type something like worksheet count. And we'll be able to explore this a little bit later and see why exactly that little bit of code I just typed in makes sense. Then just hit enter. And then I get that answer. I can also ask a question like, what value is in range cell C3? And it will tell me exactly which text. So now we know that we can also choose to execute little bits of code here. For which we do for different reasons. Like make a quick edit, or maybe test out a line of code and see if it's going to work. The last thing we want to understand about our VBA interface that before we move on and start doing the coding is, we want to know where our object browser. And we want to know what it is. This is another thing that I want to be able to see. So, I'm going to go to the View drop-down menu and choose my object browser. And I'll see this extra window that pops up here on the right-hand side. Now this is a library of all the cool kinds of stuff that you can do with VBA. Now, when we're first starting out, we're just going to learn a few more about it. And this will be great to getting started with VBA. And now scripting will start, so keep watching. Now I have opened a new workbook called Font, and now I will open the VBA on the right-hand side of our screen, so that you can see them both side by side. If we have our Excel window and VBA window side by side, we can watch the macro creation as the recorder works. So, let's go ahead and record this macro here. Here we are going to change the font type for this sheet here. So, let's me first type some words here, anything you want, and then I want to change font styling to, let's say, Arial Black. And so, every time I create this report, I don't need to go and use this font drop-down menu. Now as we're doing this, make sure to keep an eye on the right-hand side, where we are going to be able to see certain changes being made by the macro recorder. We're going to the Developer tab. You will see a little button, and I'm going to click Record Macro. And we'll call this one, Font Type with no spaces, and I am going to store it in this workbook. And click OK. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is to select All Sheet, and then I'm going to the Home tab. And I'm going to choose to change all the font here to Arial Black. And now we are done, so I'll click on my Developer tab and hit the Stop button. And that's created this macro here. Now on the right-hand side, you'll see that this new folder was created called Modules. I didn't have this folder a few seconds ago, but the moment I started to record a macro, I did get this folder. And now I can open this folder and look in the module that is created here. And if I double-click on that, we will see the code window. So, I do have this macro called Font Type. And this is what the macro recorder recorded. Now let's go ahead and take a look and see what the macro recorder recorded. It's everything from the word sub down through the end, where it says, end sub. Now you'll find that all your macros are going to have this kind of a structure. They're going to need a beginning statement and an ending statement. They help hold everything inside together. Some other patterns we will notice is all the green text here. And at the beginning of these lines. And this little apostrophe. That apostrophe is used to comment out certain lines of stuff. So, if I wanted to make a note to myself for later on, maybe I want to say, this is to change the font to Arial Black. Hit my Enter key. And then notice that shows up as green. And it isn't going to be run as code. It is just a note for us, and it is called commenting out. Now, when I start to look at the code that the macro recorder created, there's a lot of lines that we don't need. Macro recorder has a habit of recording extra stuff that's not needed, and you will see this line that says, do you want to put a strike through on the text? And it says false, which means no, I don't want to strike through. No, I don't want a superscript. No, I don't want a subscript. No, I don't want an outline on the font. No, I don't want a shadow. So, these just extra stuff that the macro recorder throws in because it doesn't really know whether or not you need it. Let's go ahead and take this concept with what we've seen so far, where it says, cells.select. And then we're going to take this little statement here that says selection.font, name it, the name of that font, it's Arial Black. And what we're going to do is, we're going to reduce this macro down to only have that little piece of text, because that turns out is all I need. So all this other stuff in here, the with statement down through end with I actually don't need. And if I were to run this, it would run perfectly fine. Now let me switch our text back to Calibri, so that then we can test our macro again. And if I place my cursor at the beginning of this macro, I can run it directly from VBA. If you look up in the toolbar in VBA, you'll see a button that looks like a play button. And the screen tip that pops up for me says, run the sub. Okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to click on my play button. And it runs that entire macro, which turned all of the text into Arial Black. So, I didn't need all this extra stuff that the macro recorder included. So, let's keep that in mind that the reason why you might want to remove this is just because if you have a large macro, it can be somewhat time-consuming to run that macro. Now we're going to be modifying some macros that we've already created in the VBA editor. At the same sheet here, let's create a new macro and change your font type here to Times New Roman. Watch the screen at the right-hand side and see how macro scripting the code for us. So now we are done. And let's stop recording. Now, sometimes we'll be modifying macros and we delete the unnecessary codes like we have done before, but sometimes, we get into a bunch of issues when we delete our codes with it saying that it has a runtime error, or it's not working. And for that reason, we want to be careful to not completely delete the code until we're confident that we don't need it. So, one more thing you need to know is that we can go into the VBA interface and directly make any edits that you want directly in the code window. As an example, in this line of code right here, where we have the font type populated, we can simply replace the word Times New Romans with Arial Black. And we'll see that this will run if I click on the play button. There we go. Now all the text in my Excel file is converted to Arial Black. Of course, I'll want to clean this up a little bit. And so, the name of my macro, which is up here, it's always after the word sub. Sub stands for sub procedure. I'm just modifying this macro that already exists, and I'm going to rename it. I'm going to call it Arial Black. Remember, you can't have any spaces there. The macro recorder still has a bunch of code in here that's unnecessary. We're going to remove all the unnecessary code in here. Now, normally what somebody would do is they would go in here and delete this. But we recommend that you don't do that. What we recommend is that you move certain pieces of font around. Such as this one that says .name equals Arial Black, and you just move this around. So, I'm going to move this up after the font. And I am going to put my little apostrophe before every single line that I'm thinking about deleting. And that would allow me to keep the code before I delete, so when I test the code out in just 1 second, I'm going to make sure that it works without all this code in here. Because the VBA program is not going to run any of this commented out code here, and it's going to skip it. I change my font to Calibri again to see the change. Then I'll run my macro, and it worked as well. And now that I'm confident that it worked without these lines of code, now I can go in here and delete these lines. Now we are done for this part, and next let's work on editing macros. Now for the next sections things will get more serious, and we need to concentrate. For this section we are going to learn about debugging. And I will click on the Visual Basic window on the right hand side. Now I will click on Module 1 to be able to see the code here. Those codes I have recorded with macro earlier to convert my report from this shape here to this shape. When we start scripting, you're going to find that sometimes it doesn't go quite right. And in fact, this is part of the adventure of scripting. All of us do run into trouble and macros don't go right all the time and it need fixing. And this is called debugging. Now we're going to be using some tools in the VBA toolbar to debug our macro here. Some of the tools that are useful for debugging aren't in the toolbar currently. You can customize this toolbar very easily. If you right-click on some of the empty space on the right-hand side, you can go down to where it says Customize. And then you can choose to go to the left-hand side and see a bunch of things that are in each one of these categories here. I'm going to find the debugging category, and I'm going to grab a couple of tools here. I'm going to find the tool that says Step Into, and I'm going to click and drag Step Into, and I'm going to place it up here. And I'm also going to grab Compile Project, that's going to help me too. There are a couple other tools in here that are nice to use. A lot of people would like to use Toggle Breakpoint. You could grab that as well. That basically allows you to just run a piece of your code instead of the whole macro itself. And there's some other ones in here that are helpful. I'm just going to grab those 2, 3. So we want Step Into, Compile Project, and Toggle Breakpoint. And once you've done that, go ahead and click on Close, and you should have those tools up in your toolbar in VBA. Now we're going to need to follow the code and see where it starts to run into problems and fix it. Now notice that what I have done here is recording several macros for steps I have done, and then I have run all the recorded macros at new macro called report formatting. As you can see here, you must be aware that when we are creating and running macros it's very hard to undo. In fact, the program Excel itself will not undo any action that is executed by a macro. Meaning anything that a macro does to your spreadsheet, you can't undo it. So that's one problem. So, when you creating your macro, remember always to create your backup. So here I'm going to the backup my data sheet before running this macro. And remember it's supposed to look like the sheet here. So, I'm going to go to my VBA interface here. And run my macros. Now, obviously that doesn't look exactly like I probably wanted it to look. So, I'm just going to go to Backup. And make an extra copy of this, where I'm going to continue to test this to know where my macro goes wrong. If I want to get this macro to execute line by line, then I'll be able to watch and see where I start to run into problems. So, I'm going to go ahead and do that. The tool that's going to allow me to do that is this button that we just grabbed and put in our toolbar, which is called Step Into. Alright, so I'm going to step into my macro here. And once I click on Step Into, you'll see that this line of code gets highlighted. Notice that this says, Sub-column Formatting. So that's just the name of my macro, and now it's highlighting the next line of code. This next line says Column Select. And now that line of code was run at Excel as you can see at the left side. Okay, so I'm going to continue to click on Step Into, and notice that each time the highlighted line moves, Excel will run the code that's in that one. Keep going until the end and we notice that the results are different than what we want. Now the added column numbering must start from A2 instead of A3 at the selected range here and here. And for the number autofill range we will make it to start from A2 instead of A3 here. And now we have fixed our coding for the insert column part. Now notice that our next macro called rows formatting, and I'm going to step into. And it's going to select rows 3, and once I click on step into, it's actually going to do that. And you see in Excel, it's selecting 3. It inserts 2 rows as the 2 lines of code says here. Now it is clear that we meant to insert rows above all the data here, but that's not what they did. They inserted rows above. Row 3 has now been moved down to row 5, and we have a few extra rows. So that's going to be one thing that we're going to need to fix. We're going to need to change that row 3 to row 1 here. Alright. Let's continue our step into. Now the macro is going to select cell A3, and it will type the report title, Grading Report for 2021, and change its format. This meant to be at cell A1, instead of cell A3 for a proper report title. So, I will change it from here. Now we will step into the last micro called font formatting. And that looks pretty good to me. Alright, and now we're on the last line that says end sub. Okay. So, I watched all these mistakes as they were happening and I corrected them. So, I should be able to now go to the sheet called backup, make another copy. And let's go ahead and run our macro on it. And we should have debugged that whole thing. And there it goes just the way it's supposed to look. Now for the next part it will get more interesting, so let's move on. From this point we will start creating macros from scratch. But before that need to know the followings. As we stated at the beginning of the video, our row should start with an object statement and it must be stated first. So, rows are an object. And then after we state the object, in this case rows, then we can say what we want to do with it, or what color we want it to be or what we want it to do. But we always must state the object first. So, for our macro we will say rows, specifically, row 1. And then we're saying, we want to insert. So this little statement of insert is a different kind of terminology. So, we have our objects, that's our rows, and then we will have this thing called insert. And insert is what's called a method. And let's look at some VBA grammar. Now let's start by talking about objects. There are many kinds of objects that you can use to start your statements. These are just some common ones. Sheets are objects, tables, charts, cells, columns, and rows are all objects. And you can use them to start your statements in VBA. Following these objects, then we need to be able to say what we want to do with them, or what we want or have some way to describe them. Maybe we want it to be yellow or something like that. Properties are the way that we describe certain objects. Like change its color to a specific color. Or maybe you want your text to show up with a format. These are descriptions about the way that any object is going to look. Or basically just descriptions about them. You can think of these as adjectives. And then the third kind of terminology we'll talk about is methods. Methods do something. You can think of these like verbs. Now let's go ahead and build this macro ourselves. Let's go ahead and build this macro ourselves. I will open my Excel sheet called Create Macro. Remember what my macro needs to accomplish here. We need to insert a row at the top of all our data. And then we're going to insert headers in that top row for each column. The third thing we're going to do is turn row on bold. And the fourth thing we're going to do is deselect. So, let's go into VBA, and we're going to create a whole new module for ourselves. So, use your Insert drop-down menu and choose Module. And that inserts a new module for us. Now, the other thing that we need to do is insert a new procedure. So, I'm going to insert again, and choosing Procedure. Then I'm going to name my macro here, or my procedure here. And I'm going to name this sheet arrangement. There are a few different kinds of procedures that you could choose. You could choose a sub-procedure. This is just a regular macro. So, sub-procedures are just like many procedures. You can think of them as like regular macros. The other kind of procedure that you can have is a function procedure. So, if there's a new function that you would like to be in Excel, maybe you need to accomplish a task and there isn't a function already for it in Excel. And so, you're having to build it using a formula all the time. In this case, what you can do is actually build it as a macro, and then it becomes a usable function in Excel. However, we will go with the basics for now. And we're choosing the sub procedure. Next is the COPE options. We have the options between public or private. We're going to be using public for the majority because public macros are macros that can be used in other areas. And I'm clicking OK. Now I have my bookends here. My first bookend says public sub, and then my ending bookend says end sub. And I'm going to need these bookends to surround any group of code, basically holds everything together. Alright, I am going to give myself a little bit of space here. Now the first step that I'm going to do is insert a row. And of course, I always must name my object first. So, I'm saying rows. That's my first object here. And I'm going to explain which rows I want to select. I want rows 1, and I want the entirety of row 1. And that's how we describe the to VBA with this column in between 1 and 1. And we surround both of those with the quotation marks. And we surround the quotation marks with this parenthesis. Following my object here, I'm always going to put a period, and then I am putting in the name of the method that I want to happen with this row. So, I want to grab this row, and then I want to insert another row. Alright, now that I've inserted a row at the top, the next thing I'm going to do is put in some headers here. So, I'm going to select range A1. That's where my first header is going to go. And the value of range A1 should be the title, and the header name, order ID. And my next header is going to go on range B1. And that's going to be quantity. And then C1 is the revenue. Now, once we put in those headers there, I want to take all those headers that I've made in row 1 and turn it all bold. So, I'm going to tell VBA, please grab row or rows, specifically, row 1. And the font's in there, I want you to turn it bold. And the way that I express that of course is with true. When I hit enter here, it makes that a proper capitalization. Alright, and when I'm all done, all I'm going to do is just to select here. Meaning I already had the row selected, that was going to turn it bold. And so, it's still going to be selected unless I deselect on range A1, and I'll just put in range A1.select. Here we go. Let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to place my cursor at the top of my macro and click on my play button. And it worked perfectly. Now we're done for this part. If you complete watching video, then now you have great knowledge of Excel VBA and how to record macros. We will have an advanced level of Excel VBA at our next videos. So, don't miss it out. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. And let us know your thoughts in the comments.